In this video, we're going to be subdividing the two objects that we created in the previous video, being the terrain and the ocean. And once we're done with that, we're going to group them into their individual squares, and we will apply a texture to them that we created earlier on in Photoshop. So to get started, all you need to do is, before you start subdividing, or at least separating the polys into separate objects, let's just have a look at the mesh itself and just see if there isn't anything we want to touch up on before we break it apart. Now immediately we can see around the edges here that when we did the conform tool earlier on, that the edges don't really fall onto zero the way they should. So what we want to do is we want to select the border to capture the entire surrounds. If we just look at it in this view, we can see, let's just isolate, it'll be a little bit easier to see that. And then I'm going to press Control and then click on Vertex. So I have all of the vertices selected all around the object. I'm going to deselect the ones on the side. And all I want to do then is I want to flatten out all of the vertices that are supposed to be at the zero position vertically. So I'm going to scroll down here. We'll click on Make Planar in the Z. And then by using the Move tool, we're going to just right-click here. We noticed that there was about 2 millimeters left over, but that's fine. There's no real issue there. So now that we have this model looking a little bit cleaner, we can start the process of basically cutting out the individual squares that we will later texture. Below we have our reference plane. This we're using to see exactly where the edges of these 16 squares are. So what we can do to this is we can convert to editable poly, and we can just drag out all of the vertices on the side so that we can see it a little bit better in our viewport from above. This will just help us as a guide to cut all the objects. The other thing we can do to make things a little bit easier is just to hide the layer for the buildings. This is the CAD layer, so we're only working with a mesh. So right now you can go into your editable poly, you can select polygon, and immediately you can start the process of detaching each of these. And here, remember, we're using these yellow lines as our guides to find out exactly where these squares are supposed to be. And exactly the same thing happens for the ocean object. We select that, we detach. Now that we've done the first row, I'm going to pause the video right here and I will detach the rest of the objects below, and then we'll come back where we left off. I've now completed all of the detaching for the rest of the two objects. So now each one of the individual 16 parts is its own object, as well as the ocean is also its own object. So each one of those is now separate. So what we can do is we can delete our reference right below it. We don't need that anymore. We don't need this either. And we're basically left with the ocean and the terrain. You can view it here. So what we want to do next is we want to group the individual square so that that is its own object. We can group that and we can call it SiteMesh01. Next thing we want to do is we want to open up our material editor, and we can then assign a V-Ray material to that, and after that we will be copying that V-Ray material over to all of the other squares. So let's open up the material editor, select a standard V-Ray material, and we will be calling that SiteMesh01. We need to make 16 materials after that for each one of the 16 individual squares. And then from your diffuse, we can go straight into the textures that we created last time in Photoshop. That would be the site satellite photos, as well as then for the reflection we will use these below. So I'm going to choose 0, 1, diffuse 0, 1. And then for the reflection slot, we will do the same thing, except we will choose the reflection image down here. Now just a couple of settings to make it a little bit more realistic is, first of all, since we used white in our reflection, we could have used gray, of course. We'll drop this down to 20, just so that we have a less brilliant mirror-like surface. You can here go and, as I mentioned, into your reflection layer and start adding more detail. If you want to have some areas that are more reflective, some areas that are less, or if you want to change things around, you can do so. And you have the flexibility there. Now in the reflection slot, we just want to make this slightly less mirror-like as well. And the highlight glossiness, instead of dropping the reflective glossiness right down, we will just fake it a little bit with a highlight glossiness. This is just to make the rendering slightly wicked and give it a little bit more of a little bit more or less of a shiny surface. Right, now that we're ready for that, we can just show the map. Select your first square, apply the texture, and we can then go and add a UV to that, and immediately you'll see that the UV map will snap on exactly into place. Now this is great because our texture, of course, is the same size as our mesh, and everything will line up corner to corner, which is really great. It makes the workflow really simple, that we don't have to align or scale any of our textures. We just have to apply them and they will snap on perfectly. Great, so in the next section, I'm just going to pause the video now while I copy all these textures across to the rest of it, and then we will have a look at how we can easily copy the UV map to each one of them, and we'll then lastly have a look at how the scene looks. Great. So I'm just going to pause it here, and then we'll be back in 2 seconds once the rest of the textures are done. Now that we have each of the 16 blocks covered with our textures, we can go and reproduce the UV map across them. So we'll take the UV map from the first one and we'll just drag it onto the second square, and we'll continue that all the way through to the 16, and you'll see that each one of them, just like the first one, will snap into place and will basically align the way we want it. If one of the textures is wrong, then you can go back to your texture in V-Ray and just see if you've added the right texture into the right slot. But most of the time you should end up with this effect. So if we go now into perspective, you'll see immediately that we start to get a good idea of what our site looks like in 3D. And we're almost getting there. We just have to add the buildings, which we will do in the next video. And after that, we can then start with our actual building. That's getting quite exciting. So in this video, what we've done is we've split up our mesh, which started out as one huge mesh, and we've split it up into these individual parts that we've gone and textured, all using the same base of texture map. All the texturing is quite simple. The materials are fast rendering. There isn't any complex reflection happening on the ocean or waves or ripples, nothing like that. It's just very plain, and we're using the diffuse texture do all of the work. We can obviously go into Photoshop and edit that if we want to make it more blue, like I've done in this case. You can tweak things as you really like it and control it from your Photoshop files. So thanks for watching this section. Now in the next section, we'll go on to the buildings.